All right, so I'm live here, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. One of the things I'm going to be doing over the next 52 weeks is doing a weekly 52 weeks of AWS live stream to LinkedIn, to YouTube, to Twitch. And I'll be talking about some of the stuff that I'm doing on the AWS platform. In this next year, 2022, I have just a ton of stuff I'm doing on AWS. I'm writing a new book with O'Reilly called C# on AWS, or rough working title. And I'm going to be interviewing a lot of subject matter experts at AWS, doing a lot of research on different things that the platform has. So I figured, I might as well just use the time efficiently, share those things I'm learning in a really free-form way. I'm not going to do a lot of planning, but I'm just going to cover stuff that I'm working on, things that I'm thinking about, and roughly, let's say 30 minutes to 60 minutes, we'll just dig into it together. So maybe to start with, one of the things that I'll do is talk a little bit about some of the ideas for the book that I'm working on, the outline, some of the raw content, and that might be an interesting place to just let you know where you may be able to start as well. So yeah, let's go ahead and pull that up here. So I'll pull that up in another window and see if I can get something cooking. So let's see here, .NET, C#, let's pull this thing up. And here we go. So let's see, let's just, I'm just gonna grab just a rough idea here, just throw it into another doc so I have it. That'll be a good way to share it. And I'll just talk about my thought process behind some of these things that I'm working on. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's do this, Google Docs. Here we go. And go to Docs. Here we go. Perfect. And then I can share my screen here. Let's go ahead and do that. And I'll probably want to do something like this. And I can do a share of this window, which looks like a good one here. Okay, so what I got here in this other section is the outline that I'm thinking of building along with my co-author on a book on C# on AWS, and I'll just maybe walk you through some of the ideas of what we're thinking about and why this is relevant to you if you're starting on your AWS journey, or if you are going to go deep into AWS. We'll have a little bit of everything. But to start with, one of the things that we're thinking about here, I'll maybe make this a little bit bigger. Let's try that. There we go. This is nice and big. So one of the things I'm thinking about is, at the very beginning, I want to set the stage on how to get started with the .NET platform on AWS. And so the idea here is to think about what is cloud computing, right? So this is really one of the foundational components to learning the AWS cloud, is to start thinking about like what is cloud computing to begin with. And really, in a way, AWS sets the standard, I think, for many clouds. If you ever take the Google Cloud certification or Azure certifications, in a way, they reference a lot of the concepts that AWS first has really made popular. And so that's just something to be aware of in a sense. Even if later you're going to go to another cloud, having a strong foundation for AWS is a good idea, especially the way AWS sees the world. Then you can compare and make your own decisions about how you want to do things. So to start with, one of the things that we're going to do is talk about the differences here between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, function as a service, and serverless, also software as a service and metal as a service. This is a really interesting area because there are a lot of opinions about the best way to do this. So for example, one of the things that may happen is that you first start building things on the cloud and you're using virtual machines. And I think that's okay. I think it's an okay approach. But the problem is they're very, very low level and they take a long time to spin up. And and that's really the infrastructure as a service component of AWS. And I like to say this analogy that the best way to think about infrastructure as a service is to think about Costco or some other big store like that. You go in, you get a huge bag of flour that's 50 pounds. Really, you don't just pull that in and eat it, right? You can't just eat flour. You need to do something with it. You need to do a little bit of work, but it's a really, really low cost. That's really what infrastructure as a service is like. It's like the raw ingredients to make a meal. Now, platform as a service is a lot more like the catered meals that you can get at Costco. You go in and maybe it's already made like poke. Actually, if you ever go to Hawaii, that's a great place to get catered food. Is they have unbelievable poke there. You can get a huge 2 pounds of it. Also, they have sandwiches. They have all kinds of catered food. You can grab that. That's platform as a service. Now, function as a service and serverless, it's a really the Wild West. Now, function as a service, what it could mean is it could mean you're running something on Kubernetes and maybe you're using EKS. It also could mean that you're using the AWS Lambda technology. So it really means some different things to different people, but in general, both of them, function as a service and serverless, they have some similarities, but in particular, function as a service means that there's a piece of code and it runs somewhere. Serverless could mean function as a service, but it also could mean more of a broader category, which is that you don't care about virtual machines, managing Kubernetes. It's all managed for you by some other thing that you don't see. You click a button, a bunch of stuff happens, and then you get a result. A good example of this would be AWS Athena. You don't do anything. You just click a button and it pulls a bunch of data and lets you do SQL queries behind the scenes. I think that's really the future of where cloud is going, is serverless technologies where they abstract out all of these things. So again, serverless could mean a combination of function as a service plus higher level, big data tools like AWS Athena. So that's really the setting the stage there. And then the next thing I was going to do was talk about key cloud computing concepts and what is elastic infrastructure. And so the idea here is that you're able to treat cloud computing a lot like you would treat maybe the utility company, where you don't have to like call them up and say, hey, I'm going to be using a lot of power this month. Can you send down the power, right? Like it's not like that, like water that gets delivered to your house. It's actually elastic, and you decide how you want to use those resources. Likewise, you can do lots of things that save on power. For example, you can get solar, you can get battery backup and do time of use. You can do all these really fancy things. You can get a Nest thermostat. All those things could be really efficient. And so the same goes with the cloud, is the more efficient you are at using cloud computing, the better the cost savings. And so that's really one of the core ideas here, is that you're able to actually leverage your expertise to get big savings, just like you can do with your utility bill. There's an unending amount of things you can do to improve the efficiency of your house. Now, the other thing that I'll talk about as well are like, what are the core services of AWS, and in particular, the two main core services would be the compute and storage. And so with AWS, I think the virtual machines would probably be something that most people would consider a compute component, but there's lots of other components, including serverless things like Lambda or Spot instances or Kubernetes. So there's lots of compute. AWS Batch is another one. And then in terms of storage, I think S3 is probably the one that most people think about, which is object-based storage. You put big object files in there, like media files, and it has the ability to elastically scale up and down. But there's other other storage solutions here that are very interesting, like elastic block storage, which you can provision disk I/O and you can mount it onto a machine and have really high performance computing that involves disk I/O. Another one would be elastic file system, EFS, or FSX, the NetApp mounted storage. These are all very interesting ideas that we'll talk about throughout this 52 weeks of AWS. Now, high level history of AWS here. This is again something I'm thinking about, is what is going to be the main thing to talk about. And I think the history would be how in the early 2000s there was the first launch of AWS. In fact, there wasn't even a user interface. There was just shell commands, right? And so it was actually a very low level service, and people built tools on top of AWS. But that was really the history, was building these low level compute and storage options, S3, EC2. These were the first services that were launched. And the other thing that's important to know about AWS is the global infrastructure. This is really a game changer because many people just will never be able to create a global infrastructure. And so there's an economy of scale factor to using the AWS platform. And then AWS, I think this is kind of a no-brainer for most people, is that in order to use it, you have to log in. And fortunately, it's very straightforward to get involved with using AWS. You go to their console, log in, set up a free account, use things like Cloudshell, Cloud9. Those are some of the things that I prefer, is these cloud-based development environments. And again, I'll talk about it both in the book I'm writing and also through this weekly live stream. And in particular, because this is going to be a .NET book, believe it or not, even though I do a lot of stuff with Python, I've done a lot of stuff with .NET, including F# and C# and PowerShell. I've actually done a lot of stuff with PowerShell as well. That there's actually very good support for .NET on the AWS platform. It's a little bit of a surprise, but you can actually use PowerShell as well inside of the Cloudshell, and you can do C# and put that inside of AWS Lambda. So there's a lot of stuff you can do in terms of your development environment by using these native tools that come with AWS. And then in chapter 2, again, we're just rough ideas about what we're working on would be AWS core services. So we'll dig into it a little bit and talk about, the storage. So, how do you develop with S3? How do you develop with EBS? How do you use EFS, the storage, the compute? One of the big things about EC2 that's interesting is that there are so many different types of EC2 instances. There's compute heavy, there's memory heavy, there's GPU, there's pure metal. And we'll talk about, what are some of the things that you should think about. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting is that most people don't talk about this, but spot instances are really your friend. And this is more of an advanced technique that you should use even as a beginner, is that a spot instance can be very, very inexpensive. And I would say probably you should get used to it very quickly, because you can rent these really powerful machines, do things with them, and you're only charged after the first minute for a second, right? So you get a first minute plus 1 second charge, really a hidden gem of the AWS platform. Another one that's kind of a stealth one that you maybe want to ask your company if you're using AWS, is did you do reserved purchasing? If you have a fixed capacity where you're running things and let's say you're running 10 virtual machines, and you're always going to be running these 10 virtual machines because they're core services for your organization, what you should do is just buy them by doing a provisioned contract of a year or 3 years, and you save, over 50% on your bill just by doing that. And so you could really be a hero for your company and save them a lot of money by purchasing that via a contract. Also, security best practices here. This is another one that's kind of a stealth one that's really interesting, is that AWS has really strong security, and by using AWS, you're going to really increase the security of your organization. And there's lots of security concepts that I'll go over the next 52 weeks, including things like principle of least privilege. So basically, you don't give your mailman the key to your house, right? You give them access to your mailbox. That kind of a concept. Also, making sure you're encrypted in transit and at rest. So basically, you always have something, basically watched by being encrypted. It's a little bit like if you see the armored car that comes in and goes to like a grocery store or a bank and pulls the money out. Notice that there isn't like someone not watching it, right? That's kind of how I think of encryption. Is it's a way of keeping watch over your data. And if it's decrypted, then anything could happen. It's like leaving the money outside. Someone will just grab the money. But having encryption is, in a sense, is like having a security guard 24/7 over your data, making sure that no one has access to it. And as long as it's encrypted and no one else has access to the encryption keys, then your data is secure. We'll also dive into SQL solutions here as well. DynamoDB is really, the premier aspect of doing NoSQL on AWS. I really enjoy DynamoDB because it's so simple to get to use, and also I like the tooling around the console apps around DynamoDB. Now, in chapter 3, my co-author Charles is going to be covering a lot of the legacy .NET migration path, which in terms of AWS, there's these the R's that they stand about, rehosting, replatforming, repurchasing, refactoring, retire, retain. These are some of the concepts that many people think about when they're moving something to the AWS platform. Also talk about some things like app to container, also .NET Core Elastic Beanstalk. And Beanstalk actually is a very fine service for doing a platform as a service offerings. I've used it a lot with multiple languages, Node, used it with Python, Java, and these are pretty nice services because they kind of bundle everything together, give you the load balancer, give you all the things that you need, and manage some of the scaling for you. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of these other things like .NET 5 and Team City versus Code Build. You may be familiar with, for example, a more of a Windows style build server, and how there's cloud native build servers here that will come with the AWS platform. And then in chapter 4, we'll also talk about modernizing .NET applications to serverless, which I think is a very cool concept, which is, I think one of the things that's cool about .NET is that there's so much automation and tooling. And I think that's the best way to think about serverless, is kind of like automation and tooling for the AWS platform. And we'll dive into all kinds of stuff. Again, this will be something that Charles will dive into, co-author, talk about Lambda and C# and step functions and SQS and SNS, which are kind of low-level building blocks like queues in the cloud. And then we'll also talk about serverless .NET microservices, like what are some of the core concepts, how to build things out with things like App Runner or API Gateway or Lambda. And so that'll be a comprehensive solution there. Then in chapter 5, we're going to dive into containerization of .NET. I think really at this point, containers are probably one of the most important technologies you could learn in 2022 in terms for machine learning, for DevOps, for everything. Pretty much, if there's anything you're doing in the cloud, you're probably going to be using containers. And so I'll talk about introducing the container concept, what they are, and then I'm also going to build out microservices, get into Kubernetes, like what's unique about Kubernetes on AWS. There's actually a hosted Kubernetes service. That's one way to do it. You could spin up your own Kubernetes cluster as well and manage that on let's say a VM, for example, or pure metal. There are some advantages to having the hosted service, but likewise, you could also use some kind of multi-cloud Kubernetes service as well. And there's a lot of emerging technologies that I'll touch on a little bit. And then there's also these AWS specific things like AWS Container Registry, ECR, which is pretty interesting because from Cloud9, for example, you can just push this in here and you can put into the ECR environment. And I use it a lot for basically deploying services to things like App Runner. And this is an emerging DevOps best practice, is that you can actually trigger a platform as a service offering like App Runner, and you can actually tell it to deploy when you push the container into ECR. So basically it does continuous delivery based on the container workflow. And so this is pretty interesting because you can essentially even bypass a build server. The build server is effectively async because the build server can programmatically build out a container, and then basically it can decide when it wants to push the container to ECR. Once it pushes to ECR, Amazon AWS App Runner, it pulls it right back out. So really containers are a huge story. And then we'll also dive into DevOps a little bit on the AWS platform. I wrote a book, one of the co-authors of a book, Python for DevOps, that's the bestseller for O'Reilly, and we'll dive into how to apply some of those best practices, especially with AWS services like Code Build, Code Pipeline. There's a lot of really deep automation that you can do with these services that I'll dive into, and also talk about third-party services, Team City, Jenkins, GitHub Actions. I'm a huge fan of GitHub Actions. We'll also talk about IAC, infrastructure as code. There's a lot of stuff happening in this space, especially, Terraform is definitely in a way the 800-pound gorilla of infrastructure as code, but there's also a lot of emerging stuff happening internally with AWS with CDK, and CDK allows you to automate, basically CloudFormation templates by using another language like Python or TypeScript on top, and we'll dive into that a little bit. And then we'll cover in Chapter 7, monitoring, instrumentation, auditing, testing, using CloudWatch alarms, developing with AWS SDK as well will be the final one, and how there are some really special features that you get with the AWS C# SDK. And really, there's a lot to like about the C# language, especially for me. A huge thing I like is that there's actually a compiler. You can create binaries. You can deploy these binaries. So again, this is just the first session of the 52 weeks of AWS, where I wanted to just talk about just whatever's on my mind for the week. Some sessions, what I'll do is I'll dive into the code and I'll just live code and talk through some things, but it'll be a little bit freeform. And, beforehand too, I'll probably figure out some way for people to ask me questions before I do a live stream so that I can kind of tackle them and do them on. But yeah, this is actually going to be every Tuesday, probably around 3 p.m. Eastern time. It's completely free. You can just attend it, and we'll just maybe live code, give me examples of things you want to take a look at. But anything's game on AWS, and maybe what I'll do to close is I'll talk a little bit about some other resources that you might be able to take a look at here that I have for free here. So if we go to AWS Bootcamp, this is a great one for people to take a look at. This is something that I taught at Duke just this year recently, and you can see it's basically a graduate level 3 to 5 week boot camp on AWS, go from 0 to 5 certifications. I have a ton of links to like official AWS material, slides, all kinds of video content that you can take a look at here. And so just really high level, again, these are some of the things that I'm broadcasting would be, this would be the resources right here that you could use for the solutions architect and cloud practitioner. And then week 2, these are certified data analytics and AWS developer. And then week 3, we go into AWS certified machine learning. And then week 4, there's AWS solutions architect pro. So another reason why I wanted to do this session every week is that I'm actually working on right now a somewhat top secret project that I'm going to release probably in January. That's a whole course on the elite level certification, which is AWS Solutions Architect Pro. And so I gave you a little bit of resources here, but I'm going to be releasing a full course on a few different platforms by the end of January as well. So basically, if you want to become an expert on AWS, feel free to join me every week, and we'll just keep cranking. And I probably will do this at least a year, maybe more. And anything I know, I'm happy to share that information with you. And yeah, I'm glad whoever could attend. And if you couldn't, check me out next Tuesday at 3 p.m. But it sounds like a good time to close. See everybody next week.